and I wanted to get your opinion about what this U.S. presidential election is going to be for U.S. businesses in general. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. I don't have any better crystal ball than anybody else in terms of those kinds of things. But a couple thoughts I'd have is like, one, I think consumers and businesses have shown us time and time again that they're resilient. And wherever the election goes, you're going to have roughly half the people that would have wished for a different outcome. But at the same time, I think you're going to have consumers will go on with their life. They're going to be planning life moments. They're going to be shopping. Even with sticky inflation, things like that, consumer spending has actually been quite resilient. And so, we're not a platform where people go for political content. We don't take money from political ads. And so we're very much focused on just how do we make sure that when consumers are looking for a reprieve from that sort of toxic political content, that they have a place they can go for an oasis away from that.
Do you think, though, we're going to see a pullback in ad spending as we get closer to the election? Marketers often feel that there's a lot of noise, clutter, the divisiveness gets ugly. Do you think we'll see, in general, ad spending?
I think advertisers are going to be extremely mindful of where they place their ads as we get to the election. And I think there's multiple reasons we don't take money from political ads. There's going to be a tremendous amount of money spent on political ads, and we won't take a penny of it. And that's for two reasons. One, that we do want consumers to have a choice for a safe space. From that, there's a place for that, discourse. But Pinterest isn't that place. So that's the one reason. The second reason is that advertisers, as we approach the election, I think advertisers are going to be increasingly concerned about where they place their ads. Yeah. They're always concerned about what environment they place their ads in, but I think they're going to be looking for a safe space for their ads. And I think with the proliferation of Gen AI, I think your misinformation and things like that have been a huge issue across social media and for ad platforms. And I think with generative AI, there's been a proliferation of the ability for people to make malicious content.
Yep.
Higher quality malicious content, more deceptive malicious content. So I think that's going to be a massive issue for a lot of platforms. And so, we're certainly mindful of that. But again, we're not a place for political discourse. So we think we, have a good alternative to that for advertisers. And we see that reflected already in the way that advertisers engage with us.
We brought up safety, right? And that's sort of at the heart of what's going on right now. Obviously, the U.S. Surgeon General announced on Monday that he's going to push for warning labels on social media platforms, advising parents that using them are basically hurting their mental health. You have been very outspoken about that this industry needs to do more. Do you agree with the mandates that he's putting out, and do you think Congress will pass it?
Yeah. So yes, I've been quite outspoken on this. I think I was the first and still the only CEO of a social media company to say that the comparisons of social media and big tobacco are in many ways appropriate. And we've done a lot to make sure that we are addressing issues on our own platform around those things. And I reached out to Surgeon General Murthy to congratulate him on the efforts. I fully support being proactive on these issues. And our focus on this is that in the same way that big tobacco needed warning labels and thoughtful regulation, you also needed a health revolution to counter it. And so while I think that warning labels may be helpful and appropriate in some cases, particularly if done thoughtfully, we're also really focused on how do we give consumers an alternative, and how do you give them an alternative for a healthy space? And so we're very focused on that.
Would you actually? He listed things he wants you all to do, right? And you do some of them already. But do you agree that you would take those three things that he put out there?
So I think an interesting parallel to this. There's sort of the warning labels on tobacco. I think there might be a better analog in this when you think about like nutrition labels, where I'd love to see a world where consumers are more informed and could differentiate between like, oh, you're going to have nutrition information whether you order a cheeseburger or order a salad. But what that nutrition label says is very different.
Yeah, but nobody looks at those labels. We don't even understand those labels today, half of them.
Well, I think those things probably do help. I think there are people that do look at those. But I think your point of like how do you make it easy for the consumer is valid. And I think this is one of the things that we're seeing. Over the last 2 years, we've seen 7 consecutive quarters of accelerating user growth on our platform. Gen Z is now our largest, fastest growing demographic, more than 40% of the platform. And one of the top reasons that Gen Z states they come to Pinterest is that they see it as an oasis away from the toxicity they experience elsewhere on social media.
Yeah.
So I think this is exactly to your point, like, yes, labels can help, that may have a place, but I think this is my point on, how do we help create the health revolution? Even if people don't look at the nutrition labels, they know that ordering a salad is better than ordering the cheeseburger for them. And how do we start to give consumers an alternative? Because I think they haven't really had that alternative. And so we've been, tuning our platform for positivity, things like diversity by default in our feeds, body type ranges, skin tone ranges, hair pattern selection, these kinds of things that are helping to create a more positive environment. And so we're just making it easy for consumers to choose a place that they know is going to be healthier, and doing that for teens.
But you have so many young kids on your platform,
Yes.
right? So are they capable of making that decision? And don't you think, should the business be regulated by the government at this point?
So, I think there's probably a place for thoughtful regulation.
Okay.
And the parallel I use for this all the time is that, so we've been talking about big tobacco. Let's look at the auto industry. There was a time when the auto industry was against safety standards for the automobiles. Go back to like Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed, the National Highway, NHTSA, the National Highway Transportation Safety Act, where you started to regulate seatbelts in the cars. But fast forward a few years, and while yes, you have seatbelts in every car, auto manufacturers now compete on their safety records.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to see a world in social media where social media companies started competing on their safety records. And so we're not sitting around waiting for regulation to do the right thing. So for example, approximately a year ago, we came out and said, we're going to make Pinterest private only for under 16. We're going to do age collection on 100% of our users before regulation requires us to do it. We're going to do private only for users under 16 because we just, from what we saw on other platforms and even some activity on our own, we came to the conclusion that it wasn't safe for children under 16 to have a publicly discoverable profile online. And so we said private only for under 16. So we're not sitting around waiting for regulation to do the right thing. And is there a place for regulation? I do think, can you set a baseline with regulation? I think that would be great. I would hope that the regulation, though, starts to set some standards that could actually spur competition. So if you fast forward back to the auto example, while there was regulation that you should have safety belts, you also started to have like crash test ratings.
Yeah.
And now you don't have regulation that stipulates every single sensor you put in the car, but auto manufacturers compete on their safety record. And so from a world, a few decades ago, where auto manufacturers, or many of them were saying that safety regulation would be against the business model, to a world today where like, you don't just want to buy an automobile that meets the minimum standards, you want to put your family in the car that, performs the best against those, and auto manufacturers compete on it. Why can't there be a world like that for social media? And so we're not waiting for that to appear from the ether. We're trying to go create that and doing the right thing.
And I think it's more important because when you talk about the automobile, it was my dad buying the automobile. It was my mom. In this case, it's my 13-year-old or my 18-year-old, and that's the difference.
On that point, though, I think this is one of the things, when we made that change to do private only for under 16, you can imagine we had a lot of discussion of this inside our company, of like, oh, is this going to hurt us with young users, right? Because, it's going to take away something that the young users want. And so we had a lot of discussion on this, and where we ultimately landed was we were just going to do it because it was right, and we were making a bet that in the long term that would work out. And the next quarter, when we announced our results that quarter, we had to give some caution around, hey, this could be a headwind to user growth. Our stock dropped almost 20% in the immediate aftermath of that. But fast forward a year later, we've more than doubled. And part of that is that what we found, to your point of Gen Z, and they're part of this choice as well. Yes, Gen Z, I think, in some ways you can look at Gen Z and say that they have become trapped in social media because if all their friends are there, they have to be there too. Yeah. But they're looking for something different also. And so what we found is as we've provided that, rather than that being a headwind for us, Gen Z users, when you ask them, one of the top reasons they will state is they see us as an oasis away from that toxicity. So being in a private space is actually working well for us with Gen Z users. So I think there are so many examples of where you can do well by doing good. And I think there's more of that we're trying to do and that I hope the industry does as well.
Maybe you just have the good kids and the bad kids will just go somewhere else, but that's a whole other set.
There's hundreds of millions of them.
Exactly. So you obviously, are on this positivity kick and God bless you. But you also had your issues, right?
Yeah.
You know, there was the news outlet that found last year that men were creating sex themed image boards for little girls on the platform. Tell me how you went about fixing that, because you know, it happens every couple weeks.
Yeah.
There's another social media platform. The Journal has done extensive investigations, obviously, much of which Congress has called these companies to the floor to question them on this, and pushing this forward.
Yep.
How did you fix it, and
Yep.
how do you prevent it from happening over and over again?
So it's a great point. So here's the thing, you know, these issues have been, you know, across every social media platform. And, you know, that had been found on many other social media platforms prior to Pinterest. We were quite surprised to find that there was some of that happening on Pinterest. To be clear, the content by itself was innocuous, but then with people collating together and then made lewd comments or things like that, that's quite disturbing. The sad reality, had we wanted to just ride out the press cycle on that, we could have. We absolutely could have, and that's what most other platforms have done. It's happening right now. There's some great investigative journalism from Wall Street Journal on this, where it's happening in the influencer and creator community. And had we wanted to ride out the press cycle, sadly, we could have, but that's not what we did. When that happened, that's what led us to, you know, we weren't aware of it. As soon as we became aware of it, we moved aggressively to go take action against those bad actors, using AI to go spot the bad actors, remove them. But those were the things that led us to the conclusion that it's just not safe to have a child under 16 publicly discoverable online, and that's when we went to private only.
Yeah.
And we just felt it was the right thing to do. But sadly, you know, we could have ridden out the press cycle. Many other platforms do, but that's not what we chose to do. We're trying to create a different
You
environment.
can't get away with riding out the press cycle anymore, because now what most journalists are doing is going back 6 months later, 5 months later, a year later, and keep checking. And that's why the work on Meta has been so successful,
Yeah, I
because
think
that's what they were doing. It was just keeps repeating every couple of months.
the industry needs accountability.
Yeah.
We called for that a year ago here.
Yeah.
Last year here at Cannes, we launched the Inspired Internet Pledge.
Yeah.
And what we called for in that was accountability for the industry. We said, let's start with ourselves, and let's measure ourselves as an industry on emotional well-being outcomes, on our safety standards. Let's measure ourselves on that. Let's publish it. Let's share what works and try to get better as an industry.
Does self-regulation really work? Every day in Cannes and every day in this business, it's another consortium, another this. How realistic at that these big issues, and they are real. I mean, these are our children. Do you think self-regulation could fix this?
So to me, it's not an either or.
Okay.
Again, I think this is a place where thoughtful regulation is likely very appropriate. I think there's lots of examples of sort of market failures happening in this. So I think thoughtful regulation is appropriate. Underscore on thoughtful. And by the way, part of what I would call for in that is regulate the outcomes versus the tactics. I think the technology moves so fast, it's going to be hard to keep up with every single tactic. But you could regulate the outcomes, just like we have crash test standards.
Yeah.
Why can't we start to think about what are the emotional well-being outcomes? And so that's what we were calling for. And, you know, it's not an either or. You know, again, big tobacco needed thoughtful regulation, but you also need a health revolution to counter it. And there are great businesses built out of that.
Yeah.
And so we want to prove there's a real business model built on positivity. You know, a more recent example, you know, you had, you know, lots of auto manufacturers funding climate misinformation not that long ago. And you've had some good government interaction to create, you know, investment vehicles, you know, things like that. But when did you start to really get momentum around electric vehicles? When there was a good business model in it, right?
Yeah.
And so we're trying to prove that there's a good business model in positivity. And 2 years in,
Right. If you're
it's
making
working.
money, people will
It's
do
working.
it.
That's right.
Do you have children?
Yes, one daughter,
One
10
daughter.
years old.
10 years old. Does she use social media?
Absolutely not.
When will you allow her to use it?
So 13 is the current age, but it's you know, platforms are created very differently, and you know what.
Is there one or two you would allow her to have?
You know, we're doing a lot of work to say that at Pinterest we think that can be a safe space, obviously. But you know, 13 is our minimum age, so you know, at 13, you know, she wants to be on Pinterest today. We do things together on Pinterest, but on her own at 13. But you know, to say it very directly, this is a big part of why I came to Pinterest. Is that, you know, as a father of a young daughter, like, I find the prospect of her being on social media absolutely terrifying, and I think every parent should be terrified as well. And I think when you look at the emotional well-being impacts to young people, you know, you've had the Surgeon General come out with this.
Yeah.
Jonathan Haidt recently with the anxious generation. that really put together a good summary of the research on this. But the research has been overwhelmingly clear for quite some time that there's meaningful impact on emotional well-being from a lot of what's happening on social media. It disproportionately affects young people, and it disproportionately affects young women. And so, as a father of a young daughter, like, it's deeply personal for me that, I want us to build a great business, but I want us to build a great business that we can be proud of and that we'd be okay to have our young people on, and that other parents can have their young people on as well.
Talk about the push and pull that you face in trying to do this, right? You talked a little bit about how you won't want political advertising, but that's really not all that hurts children, right? I mean, it's normal advertising every day. So do you accept like the diet drug craze? Do you accept those on your platform?
We don't, and I think this is where there's always more work to do, even for us. Like we've talked about tuning the AI for positivity, tuning for inclusivity. We've seen great progress there. One of the recent launches we had in our inclusive AI was body type ranges to say, hey, there's not just one image of beauty, right? And people come in all shapes and sizes, and there's lots to be proud of. And so, I think, but there's more work for us to do on this. And I think on the advertising, we are thoughtful about where we take money, and so taking money from.
But what's that like when you've got a CFO who's like, there's how many billions of dollars now going into these diet drug ads?
We have a fantastic CFO who is absolutely fully aligned with. We're going to have a great business by doing.
So he's like, okay,
things.
You don't need to take that money. Oh,
sorry.
Sorry. Good she. Woo, she. Love it. Love it.
Yes.
Now that's positive.
Yes, she is absolutely aligned with that. Our entire team is. This is the business we want to build.
Okay.
And again, I think that is, I came to Pinterest for this reason, that I think we can build a great business on positivity. That is my hope, is not just that, I don't want us to just be, back to that auto safety example, if there's a future state of the world where we build like the Volvo of social media, that's great, but I think even better, if we can inspire the broader industry to compete on safety, that's what'll be a win for me and our whole team.
All right, we're going to move to AI, but I'll give you one more question on this. Obviously, everybody's, algorithm's going to fix everything, but one of the things that's really interesting is in the fact that these algorithms basically promote addiction, right? It's like, Netflix does it, right? Now that thing comes up, your next program. How do you avoid having that algorithm when you're selling advertisers on the fact that you're now growing better than most companies with this Gen Z? Yeah. How do you make sure that you're not doing that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So, I think there's, AI, like any technology, can be used for good or for bad. And so we're very focused on how do we use AI for good. And so, we talked about tuning AI for positivity. We actually use AI to spot bad actors on the platform and get them off. But there's also things that we're doing to look at, well, what kind of engagement do we want on the platform? So one of the big changes I made when I came into Pinterest was that, if you look across social media, I think a big part of what made social media more toxic was when AI was put in charge of the content that we see. And it was given the objective of maximizing your view time. Yeah. And what happened is that the AI figured out pretty quickly that like what keeps you looking the longest is showing you triggering content. And even more precisely, because people would say, oh, I don't just see triggering content, I see some positive stuff too. Yeah, it's figured out how to keep you on the dopamine roller coaster. I showed you some negative stuff for a little while, now I'm gonna show you some positive stuff. Oh, you've been happy for too long? Let's bring you back down and show you some negative stuff, and then, after a little while of that, bring you back up.
It feels like Han.
Yeah, and so if you just ask the AI to solve for view time, this is the outcome, and this is what we've seen. We all had this experience that, social media used to be a place where you reconnect with long-lost friends, and it was helping democracies rise up and all these things, and then one day it wasn't. Well, what's shifted? It used to be a chronological feed of what your friends posted, and then over time it became, way before the current conversations on Gen AI, AI's been in charge of what you see on social media for many years, and it just figured out that you linger for longer on triggering content, on things that may make you feel worse about yourself. And so back to what we're doing, we're tuning it for positivity, and we're not optimizing for view time. So when I came in, we shifted from a view time optimization to an action-based optimization, and giving users more explicit ability to say what they're interested in. So let me make this more tangible. When Pinterest was optimized for view time maximization, we saw a lot of the same triggering content rising on Pinterest that you see on other platforms. That was deeply troubling. when we shifted to optimizing more for things that users say they want to see again, where then you're engaging their conscious mind. It's not just what you looked at, which can get sort of made you look kind of content, but when you trigger their conscious mind and ask, like the metaphor I use for this a lot is we've all had this experience of being stuck in a traffic jam, and when you get to the front of the traffic jam, you shouldn't look at the car wreck. We know that, but we all do. I sat here for 45 minutes. I want to know what happened, so we all sneak a peek. In a world where the AI determines what you see, and it's asked to maximize view time, it says, oh, you looked at the car wreck. I'll show you another car wreck. Oh, you looked at that one too, until it's all car wrecks. But if you ask somebody, do you want to see another car wreck? Most people would say, oh, goodness, no, that was terrible. So we started not just in the AI, but in what we tuned for, saying, well, let's find ways that the user can state what they're interested in. And that's when all of a sudden, instead of in child psychology, you sort of say downstairs brain versus upstairs brain. You engage the upstairs brain, and the upstairs brain says, like, I don't want to see the triggering stuff, and you get a choice. So we're bringing in more choice. We're tuning not for view time, but for actionability. And back to your question on advertising, it actually aligns well with the business model, because if you look at our growth, how we doubled our revenue growth rate from H1 to H2 last year, and then we doubled it again in what we published last quarter, roughly. And a huge part of that has been driving actionability for advertisers. But back to the view time issue, so much of that actionability for advertisers, we're helping people to do things that engage in the real world, not just
and what they wanted to see and
what they wanted. So whether it was help me find a great outfit for Cannes, or refresh the wardrobe for summer, or how do I cook a meal that's going to be great to gather a group of friends or family? How do I redesign a room for hosting? These are all things that have tie-in to what people are doing in the real world. So we're building a business around not just positivity, but we're building a business around what you do off of Pinterest, off of that screen.
We brought up AI, and obviously everybody's been using it, and sometimes you say to yourself, maybe the machines need a little help, and maybe some humans should be hired to do some of this stuff, but that's a whole other conversation. Obviously, AI is the topic. How is it going to impact everyone? Obviously, Google and Meta have dominated this industry for so long now. Do you think, with Gen AI coming along, that there will be a restacking of the tech industry?
So, I think it's a disruptive technology for sure. I think though, I think it'll play out in maybe some different ways than people expect. So a couple of things I'd say. One, sometimes you hear this argument of like, isn't it going to be the case that just the largest get better, right? Because it's a game just for the largest platforms. And I think it's actually a little bit more similar to like cloud computing, where there's, I think, a democratizing element of Gen AI as well, where in cloud compute, it made it so you could have looked at cloud computing a decade ago and said, doesn't that mean just a few platforms are going to be the winners? But in reality, yes, you'd only have a few platforms that are massive in cloud compute, but you have so many more businesses that can thrive now because they're able to easily access building blocks in cloud compute. We've done 5 startups, right? The first 3 of those startups, like we had to build our own data centers. Like, oh my gosh, like no startup now would even conceive of building their own data center. It's so much easier to get going. That had a democratizing effect. I think with Gen AI, you're going to see similarly that there's going to be building blocks available to a lot of folks. And one of the things I've said on this, I talked about this at Davos almost 5 years ago, exactly 5 years ago now, that AI thrives on feedback loops. So I think as these AI building blocks become available, businesses really ought to be looking at like what are the unique feedback loops in their business? Because then you can take off-the-shelf AI and train it to do something unique in your business. And for us, this is where we have human curation at scale, where it's not just that we can show you great shopping recommendations. People spend time on Pinterest planning outfits, planning vacations, so we can make great recommendations from our AI.
You brought up that training, though. Like, basically, the business of digital advertising, it's the surveillance economy. But as we move into this AI world, privacy is going to be at the forefront again. How are you training your models on the content? How much of a consent are your users giving? And do you think this is the next, surveillance economy on crack cocaine that we're about to see?
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. I think you've got to, platforms each operate in very different ways, and I think you've got to sort of like peel it back a little. And so if you think about privacy, I've been talking about this for a while, that like with cookie deprecation coming, Apple already made their move on cookie deprecation. Chrome cookie deprecation is coming Q1
eventually.
next year. Yeah, it's moved a few times, but I think it's clearly going to happen. as third-party cookies go away, I think that shifts the whole industry from this surveillance issue to how do you do these things in a privacy-safe way. But then I think you're also going to see delineation across platforms around where users have real intent and where users can find the ads helpful. So let me make that a little more tangible.
Right, but do they want you training it on their content?
So here's the thing. Let me make this a little more tangible. If you look at most of social media, this is where Pinterest is very different than the rest of social media, or most of social media. Most of social media, the users in an entertainment-based context. They're there to, whether they're watching funny dance videos or watching longer form content, they're there for entertainment. And the ads are an interruption from that thing that they're trying to do. And while you would hear like, oh, well, we can serve you great ads because of the influencers that you're following, which one do you think mattered more? The handful of influencers you were following on that platform, or the fact that they were tracking you across every single retail site across the entire internet? Obviously the latter. As cookies go away, I think you'll see a delineation between entertainment-based social media platforms and platforms where the consumer expresses intent directly. And to be very clear, Pinterest doesn't need to track you around the internet to know what you're interested in. People come to Pinterest and tell us what they're interested in.
Right.
That not only puts us in a place to be able to serve great relevant ads, without third-party cookies, it also says that the ads are aligned with the user. So instead of it being the case that, oh, I went and looked at this thing and now it's following me around the internet, I came to Pinterest and said, help me with what to wear to Cannes.
Right, but
and if I see an ad that shows me a great relevant outfit, that's a good thing.
Are they okay with you training? But that's the point. Like, even though you're doing it within your own holes and you're not tracking them outside, if you're training your models based on their data, how explicit is that for them, and do they understand that?
I think this is one of the primary reasons people come to Pinterest. So if you ask users on Pinterest, I think it's really about agency for the user. And so when the users track around the internet without their knowledge, that's not agency for the user. When they're seeing recommendations on a platform that are based on them being tracked around the internet, that's not agency for the user. When a user comes to the platform and says, help me find a better outfit to wear to Cannes, right? And you show them great recommendations and they say, oh, you understand what I want to wear, and you make a great recommendation, that's agency for the user. So on Pinterest, users are actually curating their tastes on Pinterest. They want us to show them recommendations from that. I think there the user has agency, and I think that's where you'll see delineation between the platforms of where were the recommendations without the user's conscious thought, where were they with the user's conscious thought? And to be very clear, users come to Pinterest seeking those recommendations is what they're there for, and we're curating based on what they've expressed on Pinterest, not tracking them around the web to make recommendations off of those
Well, I think
things.
we all celebrate cookie deprecation, and now we've just replaced it with your shopping behavior, because that's going to be better. Like, that's the other thing that's hilarious. We're like, oh, it's going to get better. We're stopping cookies. It's just going to be your shopping behavior. I think there's going to be a whole new tidal wave of that's going to happen.
Well, I think it depends on, again, I think it's about what the user understands is happening. So the world that I love to see, and this is what we're solving with shopping on Pinterest. I think the first 25 plus years of e-commerce sort of solved for buying and killed shopping. The distinction being that, the first 25 years of e-commerce is sort of utilitarian, how do I get it the cheapest and the fastest? But, you have, depending on what data you look at, 70 to 80% of shopping has not yet gone online.
No.
So what's that other 70 or 80%? It's walking into a great boutique and having someone help you style an outfit, right?
Yeah.
It's walking the bazaar, it's being inspired, it's discovering. And so that's what we're trying to build on Pinterest. And again, I think when the user says, I understand this is personalized to me, I wanted it personalized to me, and it's personalized to me based on actions I took where I curated on this platform, I think that is with the user's understanding and the user has agency. I think when it happens that users are being tracked around the web and they're seeing a recommendation on a platform where they had no shopping intent, I think that's more the sort of insidious nature of what you're describing.
We'll
but
talk
I think we're very different
about
from that.
retail, but I still want Amazon to buy you so I can just click and order from Amazon. But that's just my dream.
But
I don't
both things
know.
should be true.
Yeah,
Amazon's a great partner for us. And I think having the simplicity when you're ready to purchase, but then also being able to walk that bazaar and discover. But then when you do discover, seamlessly buy. That's been part of what we're solving. We're doing with great partners like Amazon.
Okay, we have a few more minutes, and I just wanted to ask you about TikTok, obviously, because basically most marketers are walking down the Croisette right now and being like, oh my God, don't ban this thing. We really, really need it. As the government sort of pushes for either this to be sold or to kill it altogether, is this an opportunity for you? And are you seeing ad dollars shift at all from you? Are you benefiting in any way, or are you using that in your pitch?
Well, what I'd say is, first of all, we're not sitting around hoping for the demise of other platforms. We're busy building a great platform that's very different than what people find elsewhere in social media. And by the way, for the last 2 years, we've seen that. That's what's accelerated our growth with both users and advertisers, that we're building something very different. We're at this unique intersection between social search and commerce. This is different than anything else in social media, and different than anything else you'd find in sort of traditional search or those kinds of things. That's really working for us. So we're focused on continuing to just differentiate on our own. That's working with advertisers, working with users. That said, you talked about regulation. I think one of the very few bipartisan issues has been concern over ill effects on social media.
Yeah.
Right? And there are different flavors of that, but I think you're seeing that with governments around the world being really concerned around what's happening on these social media platforms.
Do you agree the government should have went after TikTok in this way?
So without commenting on any one platform, I do think to say that governments are increasingly concerned with what happens with your data, where it's going, what's being done with it, and are going to take action to make sure that consumers are protected. I think you see that happening around the world in lots of different flavors, and I think you should expect more of it. And again, as that happens, that's where we feel really good that we have a much more, we have intent expressed directly on our platform, and so we're able to give users great recommendations in a privacy-safe way. But I think you're going to see more and more of that. It's bipartisan here in the U.S., and I think it's happening with governments around the world.
Awesome. Since he's not going to tell me that Amazon's buying them tomorrow, I'm going to open it up for questions. Anybody have a question for him? Gentleman in the back.
Hi everyone, my name is Harvey. I am from London, as you lot can tell from my accent. Quickly, I want to ask you about, you spoke about Pinterest not tracking users outside of the platform. How does the Pinterest pixel behave very differently from the Facebook pixel?
Yeah, so I think there's a different, so as cookies deprecate, there's sort of two things to think about. There's when was it being used to sort of serve relevant ads, and when is it being used for ad measurement? And so, as we think about that, I think companies are in similar boats on ad measurement, where everybody's got to move to privacy-safe measurement, where instead of measuring that one individual user, how do you move to privacy-safe features like clean rooms and things like that? And so the whole industry is moving in that direction. My comments on the relevancy of the ads, those kinds of things, we don't need to track users around the internet to know what they're interested in. They come to Pinterest and tell us. We're not reliant upon tracking activity across other retailers to know what they're interested in. They tell us directly. So just like the rest of the industry, we're moving towards privacy-safe measurement. But I think we're very well positioned relative to the rest of social media in that users express intent directly on our platform. We know users' preferences because they curate on our platform versus needing to track them around sites across the web.
But don't you then track them when they go to the retail site from your site to make sure that you can then offer the advertiser proof of return of the ad they saw?
So this is the measurement point, and
Yep.
this is where the whole industry is moving towards privacy-safe measurement, where instead of measuring that one user, you start to do things that basically look at like cohorting and those kinds of things that are privacy-safe. So instead of it being that one user that's measured, you're measuring it at cohort levels and those kinds of things. So the whole industry is moving toward that, and so we're moving in that same direction.
But if a cohort means that you're, a Walmart, or let's just take any client, and they put up 1,000 names into a cloud and say, can you target these people? These are our customers, number 10, and then you give them back. Well, are we getting to a point where it's 40% of the cohorts that you gave me, but not individuals, actually clicked?
I think that's generally correct, yes. And instead of knowing this specific user bought this specific thing at this specific place, it'll be more, users in a cohort behaved in this kind of way, and so that's privacy-preserving technology.
Okay. Any other questions? One in the front.
Hi there. My name is Carrie.
Hi, Carrie.
I own a global communications agency, Sway. I am a global campaigner on suicide, bereavement, and suicide prevention. And Pinterest has taken some remarkable steps. I also have a daughter who's 6 and 16. And I wanted to ask you the question, you've talked a lot about the children, but I'd love to know your position on the parents. Because one of the biggest problems we have is the generational divide in technology, and parents just not getting either the tech or how to help their children. And so I'd love to know what programs you have for parents and how you're advancing that conversation.
Yeah, fantastic question. So 2 things I'd say. I think the first is, we've got to make it easier for parents to do the right thing, right? And, I'd love to see a world, where consumers have more choice and more clear understanding of how different platforms are going to deliver different kinds of content. If you look at the prior media world, at some point you stop calling it social media, it's just media, because it's where most of the consumption of media is happening now. But in the prior media world, you understood, in a cable TV environment, for example, you knew like, oh, well, these kinds of TV stations, may not have safe content for my kids. These ones do, and I can make a choice of, which ones I let my kids watch. Well, as the content fragmented over the last several years, the platforms actually consolidated. So you had just a few platforms and the user lost choice. I would love to see a future world where in the same way that you could say, oh, well, I know if I put it on the Disney Channel or, network TV before 8 p.m., it's gonna be generally safe for my kids. I hope it's not just us. I hope there's a future world where there's multiple platforms and the platforms sort of fragment back out and users make choices based on what types of content. Oh, if I want political news, I can go to this platform that's the town square for political news. If I want places where I know, my kids are gonna be safe, I can go over here. And so I think we've got to give consumers more choice, and then on parents, make it easier for them to take safe actions, like knowing, okay, this platform functions differently than this one. I think also on parental tools, the parental tools have to be easier as well, where like, right now they tend to be buried, they're way deep down in the settings, you can't figure it out. And, two ways we're approaching that. One is, try to give simple, tools where, with us when we did age collection, parents can go in and set a passcode for like, okay, here's the age of the person using this app, here's the passcode that I, the parent, know, super simple. But then also, we're just trying to make it safe by default, right? And I think we need more of that where, safety should be the default, and that's the way that we're trying to operate. And we're not perfect. There's, we've had a lot of lessons learned from the past. Tuning for more positivity, tuning to keep bad content off, but then trying to make it easy for parents to take the right action.
I think when your daughter's 13, you're really going to want the government to say, no social media for 13-year-olds, anybody under, because as a parent, it's a struggle, because every parent sitting here, like, if we could get them all around a table and say, none until 13, then I can say, because you don't want your kid to be the only kid in school that doesn't have it, that has an emotional effect on them as well.
I agree with that. In fact, I would say, you've got to parse the platforms, but when you look at a lot of these most insidious sort of things on the platform, I would say it may be 16 or 18 on some of these things, right?
Agreed.
And it's not just the social aspects of it. I think you have to look even deeper where, you talk about like triggering content surfacing, things like that. But there's other things you look at in terms of like the way products get designed, where so much of what's affecting teenagers is how these platforms prey on social hierarchy. Right? So we all went through this of like, oh, were you with the in crowd or not? Like, think about that in junior high. Like, did you make it into the in crowd? And that was really hard to go through. You're trying to find your place. Well, now, you'll have apps that'll say, oh, I'll show you where you sit in the social hierarchy. And if you're too low in the social hierarchy, not to worry. The way you could improve your status in the social hierarchy is more messaging on our platform. Yeah. Right? And so I think these kinds of things, those may not be safe at any age, but I think some of these things, again, this is why we made the choice that under 16, no publicly discoverable profiles, private messaging only, because we view these things as probably not safe below 16. Yeah. And so I think 13 may not even be old enough, because if you look at, sort of from a child psychology perspective, the mind is still developing at that point. So preying on these issues of social hierarchy, showing triggering content, 13 is probably not a good age for that either.
I say lock them in the closet till they're 18. Do we have time? Do we have time for one more question? All right, one more. There's a gentleman all the way in the back that's been like jumping up and down, and I feel bad, so we're gonna get him.
Thank you. Is that working? Good. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Sid Wilson. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility in Washington, D.C. My question is, can you talk about how you think about your multicultural strategy, given the changing environment for diversity, equity, and inclusion? And how do you think about that from a customer standpoint and also from an employee standpoint?
Okay, fantastic question. Thank you. I talked before about doing well by doing good. And this will be one, by the way, that'll just give you like a little bit of like uplift for humanity, right? So as we've talked about inclusive AI, there's things where we've designed the product, things like hair pattern searches and body type ranges and these kinds of things to say, hey, there's not just one image of beauty. People shouldn't have to work hard to be seen. We've also done things like diversity by default in our product. And back to that, like make you feel good about humanity, we actually found that diversity by default in our feeds was higher engagement across user types. So it's not just that people want to see more people like themselves. People want to see results that reflect the population and all the beauty of all the different kinds of people that are in the population. And so we remain deeply committed to, how we drive diversity, how we serve the diverse population on our platform well through things like diversity by default, things like inclusive AI. And it's another example where you can build a good business by doing the right thing, and users actually find it more engaging. And we've seen that with these specific features, things like hair pattern searches and skin tone ranges and these kinds of things, they are some of our highest resonating user features. And so again, there's some of these things that regulation can be a baseline, but I think it's so much better. Why can't we prove there's a good business in doing the right thing? And this is a great example of it.